My son was doing his homework at the kitchen table when his uncle Darnell called. The speakerphone was on. It always was when Darnell called, because my son, Theo, liked to hear his uncle's voice while he worked, liked the company of it. I was in the next room folding laundry when I heard the shift in tone. Not the usual easy chatter about basketball or video games. Something tighter, something wrong. Theo was 12 years old. He heard everything. $420,000 embezzled from the nonprofit where Darnell had worked for 9 years. Confessed out loud, nervous and rambling, probably thinking he was talking to voicemail or talking to the walls. And my son, my quiet, serious, homework doing son, picked up the phone and said, "Uncle Darnell, I heard everything. You need to turn yourself in." There was silence on the line. Then Theo gave him an address. The FBI field office on Meridian Boulevard, 4.3 miles from our house, because Theo had looked it up in the 30 seconds it took his uncle to stop breathing on the other end of the call. Some people, when I tell them this story, say Theo was brave. Some say he was too young to understand what he was doing. What I know is that my son understood exactly what he was doing. He had been raised to understand it. And what happened after that phone call? What happened in that courtroom? What happened in that family? Started long before Darnell ever picked up the phone to confess. Let me tell you how we got here. Darnell Ockaffer had been my husband's younger brother for 34 years before any of us knew what he was capable of. My husband is Leon Scott, and Darnell is Leon's biological brother. Same parents, same house on Fenwick Street, same Sunday dinners. When Leon and I married 11 years ago, I inherited the whole structure. Leon's mother, Claudette, who had opinions about everything including my hair. Leon's Aunt Rosaria, who managed the family's social calendar like a military operation. And Darnell, who was charming and funny and always short on money in ways that nobody questioned because he was charming and funny. I am Nora Scott. I was 31 when I married Leon, 33 when Theo was born, and 42 now. I have spent the better part of a decade being quietly underestimated by a family that loves me in the way that some families love the people they've decided are lesser, warmly, generously, and with complete confidence that they know better. The first time I understood the shape of it, Theo was 3 years old. We were at Claudette's house for Easter, and I mentioned that I was considering a transition, moving from my position at the community foundation, where I'd worked for 6 years, into something more independent. I didn't give details. I was still figuring out the details myself. Claudette set her fork down slowly, like she was making a point of it. "Nora, honey, you have a toddler. This is not the time to be making big swings." I said I understood her concern. "Leon works so hard," she continued, glancing at her son like I'd suggested he quit his job, not me. "You don't want to put pressure on him." Leon, to his credit, started to say something. Rosaria talked over him. "The foundation is a good, stable position. Benefits, pension, you know how rare that is?" I nodded. I had that morning before we drove to Easter dinner, reviewed the terms of the first consulting contract I was about to sign. $83,000 for 6 months of work. Renewable? I didn't correct them. I smiled and asked Claudette if she needed help clearing the table. That was the first time. There were others. The second incident that matters happened about 8 months later, around the time Theo turned 4. Darnell had come to us needing a loan, $4,000, he said, for a car repair and a security deposit on a new apartment. Leon wanted to help. I said it was his decision, but I thought we should document it. A simple note, the date, the amount, the terms of repayment. Darnell laughed when Leon mentioned it. "It's family," Darnell said. He said it the way some people say it, like the word itself was supposed to overrule everything else. "You don't put family on paper." Leon looked at me, I looked at Leon. We gave him the money, no paper. I already knew, in the way you sometimes know things about people before you can prove them, that we would never see it again. We didn't. Darnell paid back $200 over the course of a year and then stopped mentioning it, and then we stopped mentioning it, and then it was just gone. A small disappearance. The kind families absorb and don't talk about. The third incident was the one that clarified everything for me. Theo was 7, in second grade, tested into the gifted program at Riverside Elementary. There was a pull-out program 3 days a week, enrichment advanced reading, a math track that the school counselor said Theo was ideal for. It cost an additional fee for materials and field trips, not significant, $240 for the semester. I mentioned it at a family dinner. Rosaria looked at Darnell. Something passed between them that I clocked but didn't comment on. "Is it necessary?" Claudette asked. "I mean, he's already in the regular program." I explained briefly what the program offered. The math track specifically because Theo had inherited something from the universe that had nothing to do with Leon or me, a genuine, remarkable gift with numbers. "Kids don't need to be accelerated," Darnell said. He said it with authority like he'd researched it. It creates anxiety. I've seen the studies. Theo seems fine, I said. You want to put him in the right environment, Darnell said. Not just the fastest one. I looked at my son across the table, who was at that moment doing long division in his head because he'd run out of things to think about during dinner. I paid the $240 the following Monday. I enrolled Theo in the program. I did not mention it again at family dinners. What they didn't know, what I had been very careful to not discuss at family dinners, was that by that point I had been running my own consulting practice for nearly 4 years. I worked with nonprofit organizations on financial systems, compliance, and fund management. The irony of that specialty, given what came later, is not lost on me. The practice had started modestly, the way honest things tend to start. That first contract, the $83,000 one I'd reviewed on Easter morning, had led to a second. The second led to referrals. By the time Theo turned 7, and Darnell was lecturing me about child development at the dinner table, I had 4 active client contracts, an office I shared with 2 other consultants on Hadley Street, and a financial advisor named Gregory Tran, who had been quietly managing a retirement portfolio, and a college savings account for Theo that had been growing for 3 years. The college account, a 529 plan, started when Theo was 4, had $67,000 in it by that Easter. Nobody in the Scott family knew it existed. I want to be clear about why I kept it private. It wasn't shame. It wasn't strategy in the way movies make it look, where the protagonist is always 10 steps ahead and cold about it. It was simpler than that. I had watched the way information moved in that family. I had watched how Darnell processed information about other people's resources. I had watched Claudette's face change, very slightly, whenever she heard something that shifted the balance of who needed what. I kept my work private because I had learned, through observation, that sharing it would create problems I didn't want. And I had a child to think about. Gregory Tran, formal, precise, never late to a meeting, had said to me once, in his quiet way, "The best financial decisions are the ones nobody pressures you about." I had thought about Claudette's face when I'd said I was considering a transition. I had thought about Darnell's voice saying it's family when Leon asked about documentation. Agreed, I told Gregory. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. You know the specific texture of smiling across a table at someone who is certain they understand your limits while you are, quietly, doing the thing they said you couldn't. By the time Theo was 11, the practice had grown enough that I had brought on a part-time associate. His name was Felix Drummond, 28 years old, an MBA from State, meticulous and a little anxious in exactly the way that made him excellent at compliance work. I also, around that time, had my first formal conversation with an attorney named Suki Hargrove, who specialized in business contracts and estate planning. We met in October, the 7th, a Tuesday, to review the operating agreement for my practice, which I was restructuring as an LLC. The meeting was supposed to be 2 hours. It ran to 3.5 because somewhere in the conversation about the restructuring, I mentioned that I also wanted to think about the trust structure for Theo's college account. Suki had listened with the kind of focused attention that good attorneys have, where you can see them sorting everything into categories in real time. "Let's separate those conversations," she said. "The LLC is clean. For the educational trust, I want to talk about your broader estate picture. Who controls what and when?" I said I hadn't thought about it that way yet. "Start thinking about it," Suki said. She didn't say it urgently. She said it the way someone says close the window before it rains, not a warning, just common sense. I made a follow-up appointment for the following month. The second conversation with Suki happened in November on the 19th. By that point, I had pulled together the documents she'd asked for: the LLC operating agreement, the 529 account records, the investment portfolio Gregory managed. She reviewed everything quietly while I sat across from her. "Your estate structure is clean," she said finally, "but I want to flag something." She tapped the portfolio page. "This is a meaningful asset, and right now, if something happened to you, the decision-making path is not as clear as it should be." I asked what she meant. "The 529 is in your name as account owner, with Theo as beneficiary, that's correct, but the beneficiary is a child." She paused. "I'd like to appoint a successor trustee who isn't a family member, someone institutional, or at minimum someone with legal accountability, just as a structural protection." I thought about Darnell's voice. "You don't put family on paper." "How long does that take to set up?" I asked. "A few weeks to draft," Suki said. "Sign by end of year if we move quickly." We moved quickly. The trustee structure was finalized before the new year. Theo was 12 by then, in the gifted program, doing math in his head at dinner tables while adults talked around him. That was the architecture I had quietly built: a a consulting practice, a retirement portfolio, a protected educational trust for my son, and an attorney who knew where everything was and what it was for. None of it was visible to the Scott family. None of it was meant to be. The close calls were not dramatic. That is the thing about real life. The moments that could have unraveled everything tend to happen on unremarkable afternoons. The first one came in early spring, a few months before everything changed. Darnell had stopped by our house unannounced. He did that, considered it warmth, and I was at the kitchen table with my laptop open, going through a compliance report for one of my clients. I closed the laptop when I heard him at the door, not because I was hiding anything exactly, but because the habit was so ingrained by then that I did it without thinking. Darnell came in, hugged Leon, ruffled Theo's hair, and sat down at the table. He glanced at the closed laptop. Working from home today? Wrapping up some things, I said. What kind of things? Reporting deadlines. I stood up and offered him coffee, which redirected him immediately, because Darnell was a person who accepted every offer of hospitality and then forgot the question that preceded it. But he looked at the laptop again. I didn't know the foundation had you doing reports. I had left the foundation 4 years earlier. Leon knew this. Claudette knew this. I had told the family I was doing some part-time consulting work. The gap between part-time consulting and a full restructured LLC with 4 client contracts and a part-time associate was something I had never clarified. Just freelance things, I said. Nothing exciting. He nodded. He accepted the coffee. He stayed for an hour and talked to Leon about basketball, and before he left he said, "You should look into getting on at the city. Benefits are solid." "I'll look into it," I said. That night I told Leon about the conversation. Leon, who knew the full picture by then, I had told him everything 2 years earlier in a long, honest conversation in our bedroom with the door closed, sat quietly for a moment. "He's going to figure it out eventually," Leon said. "I know," I said. But not yet. Leon had his own complicated relationship with his brother. He loved Darnell. He also had a clear-eyed memory of the $4,000 that had become $200 over 14 months. He trusted my judgment about timing. The second close call happened 6 weeks later and was sharper. Rosaria had organized a family dinner. She did these once a month, rotating houses, and it landed at our place. I had spent the morning on a call with Felix about a new client intake, and I had left my notebook on the counter, the spiral kind I used for client notes. It had a client organization's name on the cover, the Hadley Community Foundation, one of my longer-term contracts. Rosaria saw it when she arrived and picked it up before I could reach it. "Hadley Community Foundation?" She turned it over. "What's this?" "Old notebook," I said. I reached out for it, and she handed it back, but her eyes stayed on it half a second longer than they needed to. "I thought you left the foundation sector." "I do some consulting for them," I said. "Old contacts." "Consulting pays well these days?" She said it lightly, the way people ask questions they already think they know the answer to. I smiled. "It keeps the lights on." Rosaria laughed at that, satisfied by the modesty of the answer, and moved into the kitchen to start arguing with Leon about whether the chicken needed more time. I set the notebook in my bag and told myself I needed to be more careful. After dinner, after the dishes, after Claudette had made her comments about the curtains in our living room, and Darnell had eaten twice what anyone else ate, and then said he needed to get going after all of it, I sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and thought about what Suki had said at our November meeting. The best protection isn't secrecy, it's structure. I had the structure. I had the documents. I had Gregory managing the accounts and Suki's name in my phone under the contact note that read simply, "First call." What I didn't have yet was a reason to use any of it. That was about to change. Because what I didn't know, sitting in my kitchen on that quiet evening with the family noise finally faded, was that 3 weeks later, my son would be doing homework at this exact table, the speakerphone would be on, and Darnell Ackhaffer would confess to $420,000 in stolen funds while talking to a 12-year-old boy who did not hesitate for a single second. The timing couldn't have been worse for Darnell. For us, it was something else entirely. The call came on a Wednesday. Theo had been home from school for 40 minutes, backpack still on the floor by the kitchen door, spiral notebook open to a page of pre-algebra he'd already finished, because Theo finished things quickly and then sat with the quiet of having finished them. I was in the back bedroom folding a laundry basket that had been sitting there since Sunday, listening to the specific nothing of a weekday afternoon. The phone rang on the kitchen counter. Speakerphone because that was their habit. Theo and his uncle Darnell had a running thing where Darnell called while Theo did homework and they talked about whatever, basketball scores and YouTube videos and the kind of conversation that 12-year-old boys have with adults they trust completely. I heard Darnell's voice come through the speaker and I kept folding. A towel. A pillowcase. Then the tone changed. I heard it before I understood it. A wobble in Darnell's voice that didn't belong there. He was talking fast, the way people talk when they've been holding something in for too long and the pressure finally finds a crack. I set down the shirt I was holding and stood very still. He said the name of the nonprofit, the Meridian Youth Alliance, the organization where he'd worked for 9 years, where he'd climbed from program coordinator to director of operations, where Leon's family had pointed at him for years as the example of what the Akafir name could do. He said the number. $420,000. He said it over the course of about 30 seconds, broken up by pauses, by what sounded like a man trying to find places to breathe. He said he'd been taking it slowly over 3 years through reimbursements that looked like program expenses, through vendor payments to a company that existed only on paper. He said he didn't know what to do. There was a silence. Then my son's voice came through so clearly it stopped me completely. Uncle Darnell, steady. Deliberate, the voice of a child who had spent his whole life paying attention. I heard everything. You need to turn yourself in. Darnell's response was not words. It was a sound, a short, cut-off sound like something landing. Theo spoke again. I'm going to give you an address. A pause. I heard the tap of his fingers on his tablet. The FBI field office is on Meridian Boulevard. You should go today. Another silence. Then the line went dead. I walked into the kitchen. Theo was sitting at the table, both hands flat on the surface in front of him, looking at the phone. He looked up at me. His expression was not distressed. It was something closer to resolved, the way he looked after he'd worked through a difficult problem, not happy, not sad, just finished. Mom, he said, I think Uncle Darnell is in trouble. I sat down across from him. I asked him to tell me exactly what he had heard. He did in order without embellishment or drama, the way he always reported things. When he was done, he looked at me and said, Did I do the right thing? I told him yes. I told him he had done exactly the right thing. He nodded like that settled it, closed his pre-algebra notebook, and went to get a glass of water. I sat at the table for another minute. Then I picked up my phone and called Suki Hargrove. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had just happened, concisely, because Suki did not need repetition or context building. She absorbed information the way a sponge absorbed water, instantly and completely. Don't call Darnell, she said immediately. Don't call Leon's mother. Don't discuss this with any family member until you've spoken with your husband. Leon's at work. Call him now, then call me back. I called Leon. He picked up on the fourth ring, his work voice on, and I said, You need to come home. Something has happened with Darnell. The quality of my voice told him everything he needed to know about the seriousness of it. He said he'd leave in 10 minutes. I called Suki back. She said, if Darnell was working with a nonprofit, this is federal territory. The organization received government grants almost certainly. That makes this a federal matter. She paused. This is going to become public. The question is not whether the family finds out. The question is who tells whom and when and how this affects your household specifically. I asked what she meant by our household specifically. Darnell is Leon's brother. If there is any family asset commingling, any shared accounts, any arrangement where your family's name is connected to his finances, we need to know about it immediately. There wasn't. I had been meticulous about that and not by accident. We're clean, I said. Good. A pause. Then your job right now is to support your husband and make sure your son is okay. Call me the moment anything official happens, a call from law enforcement, from the organization, anything. I told her I would. Leon came home. I met him at the door. His face when I told him, and I told him everything, from Theo's homework to the phone call to the address my son had given his brother with the same calm he used to report math answers. Leon's face went through something I don't have a word for. Not shock. More like a man watching a building he'd lived in all his life shift on its foundation. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair Theo had been in. He looked at the surface of the table for a long time. Then he went down the hall to find his son, and I heard him, through the closed door, tell Theo that he was proud of him. I heard Theo say, I know, Dad. The simple, complete confidence of a child who has always been told the truth. Darnell turned himself in 3 days later. Not that day, not the next, but 72 hours after my son gave him the address. His attorney, when he found in the interim, negotiated his surrender. The FBI had already begun an investigation. The Meridian Youth Alliance's board had flagged discrepancies in their annual audit 2 months earlier and had quietly referred the matter to federal investigators. Darnell did not know this. He thought he was ahead of it. He was not. The day Darnell's surrender became known to the family was a Saturday in March, the 8th, Leon's mother's birthday, which had already been planned as a dinner at Claudette's house with the extended family. Claudette herself, Rosaria and her husband Bernard, two cousins on Leon's father's side named Quame and Adiz, and us. Theo had been invited but had a school project due Monday, and I had quietly arranged for him to spend the day at his friend Marcus Choi's house. I had known, from the moment Suki said the word public, that this Saturday was going to become something different from a birthday dinner. I wanted Theo somewhere else when it did. I was right. We arrived at Claudette's house at 6. The table was already set. Rosaria had made Claudette's preferred cake, lemon, 3 layers, and it was sitting on the kitchen counter with candles not yet in it. Bernard was in the corner nursing a drink and watching college basketball at a volume that suggested he'd rather be doing only that. Quayme and Adiz were at the end of the table, already into a disagreement about something that had nothing to do with anyone else. It was Leon who told his mother. He'd insisted on that he be the one before dinner privately. I stood in the kitchen with Rosaria, who was slicing something she didn't need to slice, while Leon took Claudette to the back sitting room. I heard Claudette's voice rise once, a single sharp note and then lower, then silence. They were in there for 11 minutes. When they came out, Claudette's face was a controlled surface with something moving just under it. She looked at me, not with warmth, not with coldness exactly, something assessing. You knew, she said, it wasn't an accusation, it was a statement, and it was true I had known for 3 days and she was processing what that meant. I found out when Theo heard the call, I said. I told Leon the same day. She held my gaze for a moment, then looked away and walked to the kitchen to put candles in her cake. Rosaria watched this with her slicing knife stopped in midair. Then Rosaria turned to me. What happens now? Federal process, I said. It's out of the family's hands. The birthday dinner happened anyway, in the way that families sometimes do things because the table is already set and not doing them feels like another loss on top of the first one. People sat, food was eaten, quietly. Bernard turned off the basketball. Quayme and Adiz stopped their argument. Adiz cried briefly and then stopped herself. The cake was cut but not really eaten. It was at the table in the middle of that terrible, quiet dinner that Claudette said the thing that changed what I was going to do next. She looked at Leon and said, "We need to get Darnell a good attorney, someone who can argue circumstances." She glanced at me, then back at Leon. "This is going to be expensive. We'll need to pool what we have." Leon said nothing for a moment. "We as in who?" I kept my voice level. Claudette's hand moved to her water glass. "Family. We take care of family." "Darnell needs an attorney," I said. "He has one, that's between him and his representation. $400,000. Rosaria said it like she was still trying to make the number real. He took $400,000 from children, from a youth program. Claudette's expression shifted, the first fracture in the controlled surface. "We don't know all the circumstances. We know the number," I said quietly. Claudette looked at me, her voice dropped, went deliberate. "Nora, you know as well as I do that Darnell has always struggled. He has never had the advantages that some people in this family have had." The table went very still. Leon looked at his mother. Quayme looked at the ceiling. Bernard looked at his drink. I understood exactly what she meant by some people in this family. I understood that she was, in this moment of crisis, reaching for the old architecture, the one where I was the one with advantages, where the balance of the family's moral ledger had Darnell on one side and me on another, where helping him came at my expense because I could absorb it. I set my fork down. "Claudette, I want to be very clear with you. Leon and I are not going to contribute to Darnell's legal defense fund, not because we don't love him. Because it's a federal embezzlement case and there is no version of that which becomes a family money problem." Claudette's controlled surface cracked further. "So you're just going to let him?" "He made a decision," I said. "Over 3 years, that's not something we can undo with a check." The dinner ended shortly after that. It did not end with warmth. If you're still with me, stay, because what happened in the 3 weeks following that dinner is the reason I am telling you this story. I called Suki the Monday after the dinner and told her about Claudette's request. Not because it was legally significant, but because Suki had asked me to report anything that felt like pressure. Her response was immediate. "Did she put a number on it?" "Not directly." "Did she suggest any particular form, a loan, a gift, pooled funds?" "She said pool what we have." Suki was quiet for a moment. "Here is why I'm glad you called. If there is any sense in which family members are being organized to contribute to a legal defense fund for a federal defendant, and if any of those contributions are structured in specific ways, that can create complications. For the contributors, not just the defendant." She paused. "You said no clearly?" I said no clearly. "Good, document that conversation in an email to me, just your own recollection, time and place, who was present, what was said. Send it today." I sent it that afternoon. What I did not expect was the second front. It came from Rosaria, not Claudette, which surprised me. Rosaria had always been the social architect of the family, not the moral authority. She organized the dinners, managed the calendars, smoothed the interactions. She had never in 11 years come at me directly. She called me on a Tuesday, 12 days after the birthday dinner. She said she wanted to talk, just the two of us, over coffee. We met at a cafe on Brentwood Avenue, a place she chose, and she arrived looking like she'd been thinking about the conversation for days. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I told her to go ahead. Did Theo tell you about the call before he told Leon? I looked at her. Theo told me the same day. I called Leon immediately. But you waited 3 days before telling the family. Leon waited 3 days. That was his decision about his brother. Rosaria's jaw moved slightly like she was chewing the answer. Claudette thinks you advised him to wait. Claudette can think what she wants, I said. Leon is a grown man. She also thinks, Rosaria started again. She thinks that Theo shouldn't have given Darnell that address. That a 12-year-old telling his uncle to turn himself into the FBI is, she looked for the word, is what? My voice was very quiet now. Inappropriate for his age. I held Rosaria's gaze across that table for a moment that felt longer than it was. Something moved through me that was not quite anger, it was colder than anger and more precise. My son heard his uncle confess to a federal crime, I said, each word deliberate. He responded with honesty and with the address of the appropriate authority. That is not inappropriate. That is exactly what I raised him to do. Rosaria blinked once, twice. Claudette is grieving, she said finally, softer. She's not thinking clearly. I understand that. I picked up my cup. But I want you to take this back to her clearly. Theo did nothing wrong. I will not entertain any suggestion that he did. Rosaria nodded. She looked down at her coffee. Then, quietly, I told her that too, actually. Before I came, that was the humanizing moment in Rosaria. She had come to deliver a message she had already argued against sending. She was caught between loyalty to Claudette and her own understanding of what was right. She looked for just a moment like someone who was tired of being the bridge in a family that kept blowing things up. I reached across and briefly touched her hand. I know. The federal case moved in the way federal cases move, not quickly, and not the way television makes it look. Darnell was charged in late April with wire fraud and embezzlement from a program receiving federal funds. The charges carried serious sentencing guidelines. His attorney entered a not guilty plea initially, which was standard. The discovery process began. What emerged in that process, what became part of the public record, and therefore part of what the family eventually learned, was the full scope of it. Not just $420,000 over 3 years. There was also a scheme involving false grant reporting that pushed the federal liability higher, and a vendor relationship that implicated a second individual, a man named Terrence Yao, who had provided the shell company infrastructure. Terrence Yao had not worked for the Meridian Youth Alliance. He had worked for 2 years in a business relationship with Darnell that had existed entirely outside the organization's records. When the fuller picture came out in June, Claudette stopped calling me. Not in anger, in something more like collapse. Leon visited his mother twice a week. I went with him once, and Claudette and I sat in her living room and talked about nothing for 40 minutes, which was its own kind of peace treaty. Rosaria called me on a Thursday in July. I was at my office on Hadley Street between client calls when her name appeared on my screen. I owe you something, she said without preamble. You don't owe me anything. I do, the coffee conversation. A pause. You were right about Theo, about all of it. Her voice had a stripped quality, like something had been taken off the top of it. I've been thinking about the $4,000. I was quiet. The loan, she said. From years ago, I knew at the time that Darnell wasn't going to pay it back. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the person who said that about him. She exhaled. I should have said something. It wouldn't have changed anything, I said. Started a long time before the $4,000. I know, but still. We stayed on the phone a little longer than the conversation required. Sometimes that's what repair sounds like. The confrontation I had been quietly prepared for, the one Suki's documents and Gregory's accounts, and my own careful architecture had been building toward, came not at a family dinner, but in Claudette's living room on a Saturday in August, 8 months after Theo had given his uncle an address on speakerphone. It was Leon who set it up, not me. He had asked his mother and Rosaria to come together, told them there were things the family needed to understand about our position going forward. Bernard came with Rosaria. Quame came because Leon called him specifically. Adiz could not make it. We sat in Claudette's living room with the lemon cake plate from the birthday dinner washed and back on the shelf, and Leon said, quietly and completely, that the requests for financial contribution to Darnell's defense were over, that they would not be revisited, that he and I had consulted with our attorney, and that our household's financial structure was not available to be used in any way connected to the federal case. Claudette's response was to look at me, not at Leon, at me. She told you to say that, Leon said. Mom, look at me. She looked at him. I am telling you this. This is my decision about my household and my family. Your family, Claudette's voice shifted. What do you think family means, Leon? Because your brother is facing federal charges. Leon's voice was not loud. It was the quietest I had heard it in months, and it landed harder for that. For choices he made over 3 years, that is not something Nora did to him. That is not something Theo did to him. Theo was 12 years old on a Wednesday afternoon doing his homework. The room was very still. Claudette's hand went to the arm of her chair and gripped it. Her composure, which had held for 8 months through shock and grief and the dismantling of her understanding of her younger son, finally did what it had been threatening to do since March. It let go, not loudly. She didn't raise her voice. She bent forward slightly, like something had gone out of her spine, and she put her face in her hands. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Rosaria stood up and moved to sit beside Claudette, putting one hand on her back. Bernard, who had said almost nothing across every family gathering since March, said from his corner of the room, "She's been carrying this alone since it happened. All of you should know that." He said it not as an accusation, but as information. The room received it. Claudette lifted her face from her hands. She looked at Leon. Then she looked at me. "I have not been fair to you," she said. It was the most direct thing she had ever said to me in 11 years. I felt the weight of it land somewhere in my chest. "I know this has been hard," I said. "I blamed you because," she started again, "because it was easier than blaming him." Her voice came out rough. "He's my son." I moved from my chair to the ottoman in front of hers. I sat down close enough that she could see my face clearly. "I know he is," I said, "and I am not asking you to stop loving him. I am asking you to let this process happen the way it needs to happen." "That's all," Quame from across the room said quietly. "That's fair, Aunt Claudette." She looked at him, then back at me. Then she nodded once like something being signed. The document Suki had prepared, the clearly structured LLC, the protected trust for Theo's college account, the clean separation of our household assets from anything connected to Darnell's situation, never had to be produced at that table. They existed. Their existence was the protection. I had built a wall not to attack anyone with, but to make sure that no matter what happened in that federal case, no matter what pressures the family generated, or what creative interpretations of obligation anyone tried to apply, my son's future was untouchable. I looked at Claudette in that living room, this woman who had underestimated me for 11 years, who had told me on an Easter morning not to make big swings, who had said with complete confidence that the foundation was a stable position and I should be grateful for it, and what I felt was not triumph. It was something quieter. The specific piece of having built something real that nobody could take from you and not needing anyone to know you built it. The hearing came in October. Darnell entered a guilty plea to the wire fraud charge as part of a negotiated agreement. The embezzlement count remained. Sentencing was scheduled for December. The judge who handled the case was a woman named the Honorable Frances Ibanez, and she had a reputation, according to Suki, for being methodical and unsentimental. What I am about to tell you is part of the court record, so it is not private. At the sentencing hearing, Darnell's attorney made the case for leniency. Character witnesses. The 9 years of genuine service before the theft. Cooperation with the investigation. Terrence Yao, the outside partner, had received a separate and heavier set of charges. Darnell's attorney argued that relative culpability mattered. The Honorable Frances Ibanez listened to all of it. She listened to Darnell's statement, in which he said he had made choices he could not undo and that he accepted responsibility. She reviewed the victim impact statement from the Meridian Youth Alliances Board, which outlined how the stolen funds had resulted in the cancellation of 2 after-school programs that had served, in total, more than 140 children over 3 years. Then the judge stood up. That is the moment Leon called me afterward. He was in the hallway outside the courtroom, voice low, and he said, "Nora," the judge stood up. I understood immediately what that meant. Judges stand when they are about to say something they need the room to feel. Judge Ibanez sentenced Darnell to 4 years and 3 months in federal prison, with restitution in the full amount of $420,000. She said, in her statement, that the funds had been taken not from a corporation or a government budget, but from a mission, from the explicit promise made to children and families in a community that had already experienced significant resource deprivation. She said that the sophistication of the scheme, sustained over 3 years, demonstrated that this was not an impulse but a pattern. She said the sentence reflected both accountability and the possibility of what she called meaningful reintegration after time served. Darnell did not look back when they let him out. Leon sat in the hallway outside that courtroom for a while before he drove home. I didn't push him to talk. We made dinner together that night without much conversation, and after Theo went to bed, Leon sat at the kitchen table, the same chair where our son had done his homework on a Wednesday in March, and he said, "I keep thinking about what he could have done with 9 years of honest work." I sat down with him. "I know. He was good at his job," Leon said, "before he was actually good at it." "I know that too." We stayed there a while, the kitchen quiet around us. The restitution order meant that any assets Darnell held were now subject to federal recovery. His apartment, his car, a small retirement account. It would not cover the full 420,000, and the shortfall became a civil matter for the Meridian Youth Alliance's insurance carrier to pursue. The nonprofit received a partial recovery and within the year relaunched one of the two canceled after-school programs with grant funding they secured in part because of the visibility the case had brought to their mission. I know this because I still work in that sector. I heard about it from a colleague. Claudette visited Darnell in the first month. Leon went with her. They did not ask me to come, and I did not offer. That was the right arrangement. Rosaria and Bernard started having us over for dinner again, quietly, without the family machinery that used to surround it. The dinners were smaller and more honest than they had ever been. Bernard talked, which he had never done much before, and it turned out he was funny. My practice had its strongest year in the year following the sentencing. Felix had moved into a full-time role. We had taken on two new clients, both regional nonprofits. And yes, the irony was not lost on me that I was helping organizations build exactly the financial controls that would have caught what Darnell had been doing. Gregory called in February to go over the year-end numbers and said, with the precise satisfaction of someone who had been right about a thing, that the college account for Theo was in excellent shape. The trust structure that Suki had set up was clean, documented, and completely insulated from anything the Scott family had been through. Theo turned 13 in November, 2 weeks before Darnell's sentencing. He asked for a chess set and a specific book about number theory he had found online. We got him both. He went to his birthday dinner at a restaurant Leon chose, just the three of us, and he ordered the pasta and talked for 20 minutes about a problem he was working through in the advanced math track at school. At one point, he stopped and said, "Mom, do you know what's interesting about prime numbers?" I said I didn't fully. He told me for the remaining 15 minutes of dinner, and I listened to every word, and Leon caught my eye across the table and I caught his. My son is fine, more than fine. He is exactly who he has always been, someone who hears things clearly and tells the truth about them, without hesitation, because that is how he was raised. I don't hate Darnell. I do not think I ever hated him. I think he made choices he could not stop making, and I think the family's habit of absorbing those choices without naming them probably made it easier for him to make the larger ones. I think about the $4,000 sometimes, the small one, the one nobody put on paper, and I think about how much a single early accounting can cost when you skip it. Claudette asked me, last spring, how I had stayed so calm through all of it. We were in her kitchen, just the two of us, the coffee between us something that felt different from every cup of coffee we'd shared before. I told her I had been building things quietly for a long time. She nodded slowly, like that explained something she'd been trying to work out. It explained most of it. The rest is just being someone's mother. So tell me this. When a 12-year-old hears something that adults have been missing for 3 years and tells the truth about it immediately, did he do too much? Or did the rest of us wait too long? I want to know what you think.